Would you please pray with me? And now may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Faith, conviction, hope, vision, assurance. Great words, these. There have been times when it's been very easy for me to be able to sign on to each and all of these. I grew up, maybe some of you did too, but I grew up in the generation that envisioned the age of Aquarius. I wanted peace, not war. I really wanted there to be and rooted for civil rights for all people, for all Americans. I was called to ministry, and I was ordained as the Vietnam War ended and as the investigation into Watergate was in full bore. And so I could tell that old institutions were crumbling, but dreams of a new world were well in hand, and I was a part of that new generation, you know, the hope of the world. And I was glad to be a part of that, a part of the solution. But we are still at war, even the Pope says so. The Berlin Wall is down, to be sure, but we're talking about building a wall to keep us from going to Mexico, or Mexicans more from coming here. In the age of Aquarius, for those of us who have lived through these years, might seem more like elevator muzak than marching orders to a new world order. We have an African-American president, but black lives still don't seem to matter. And no one is safe. There are movements to topple governments, even our own. We certainly are on the defensive in our churches, and certainly all nonprofits, it seems, in our country seem to be having some of the same problems that we do, diminishing and aging memberships. So confidence in our convictions, our hopes, our visions, our assurance of faith are getting harder and harder to muster. I spent 40 plus years in active ministry trying to bring about solutions to the problems of church and society, because after all, you heard what the era in which I was called, and I bought into that. But a couple of weeks ago, I was having a conversation with a millennial-aged grad student at SU, during which he told me something that his professor said to the students. He said, I don't know who the professor was, he or she, but the professor said that the world would not change and that good decisions couldn't be made until the baby boomers were all dead. Yes, and he was talking to a baby boomer, you know, and I said, and he even complimented me, saying, "Well, you think like a millennial." That's a big compliment, he said. And I thought to myself, I don't think like a millennial. I know a little bit the way millennials think, but you know, thanks very much. But I hope I'm going to be here a little bit longer. Anyway, for the last 2 weeks, I've been perhaps considering that maybe instead of being part of the solution, I'm a big part of the problem. But I tell myself, Jesus invited me to this table of grace and blessing and love. To remember his love and to remember the challenge to hope through participating in the life that he makes possible. And so I remember. I also try to hope, but I remember. I remember those, my own life, but I also remember those who have gone before. My father-in-law is now in his 90s, but when he was a young, strapping 20-year-old, he was a navigator in a B-24 bomber with the job of helping to liberate Europe from Nazi Germany. During World War II, he was stationed in England. He displays the photo of his crew proudly crouching in front of and smiling, crouching in front of the bomber. We all know what they were ordered to do. They were sent on very dangerous bombing missions, and it was amazing that any of them made it back safely, but that whole crew did. And they had reunions up until the mid-90s, I think. The picture of those young, strapping men, smiling and confident looking, belies the terror and the horror of the job that they were called to do. In preparing for this sermon, I remembered that 71 years ago, 2 bombs were dropped in Japan that exploded us into the nuclear age. A bomb loaded with uranium was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th, and a bomb loaded with plutonium, was dropped on Nagasaki on August 9th. Tens of thousands of people were killed in an instant, and another tens of thousands more were injured. Between 35 and 40% of those cities were leveled. I saw the photos of the crews of those 2 bombers, B-29 bombers, and they looked just exactly like the photo that my father-in-law has displayed on his room. Young, smiling, confident lads. I'm not trying to cast blame here, I don't, because I know why they did it. I even can understand the logic and agree with it. We thought that dropping those bombs would shorten the war and reduce the number of total people killed and wounded if we took the alternative, which would have been to invade Japan. But Pandora's box was opened. And we have lived in fear of someone using these bombs in anger ever since. We justified our use of them in order to save lives. And there were some who even thought, I read the note of a observer that went along with the flights, who was a reporter for the New York Times, who said he didn't question what they were doing at all because he remembered Pearl Harbor and the Death March to Bataan. But soon we knew what we had done. We're the good guys, you know. We're the good ones. And yet we were the ones who unleashed that terrible weapon of mass destruction. It wasn't the Nazis, it wasn't the Japanese, it wasn't the Soviets. We were the ones who did it. Since then, we've worked for reduction of nuclear stockpiles, and tried to keep other nations from getting nuclear weapons or the capacity to make them. But we were the ones who did it. We need to remember that as we have tried to be a part of the solution to this, we also were part of the problem. And so President Obama went to Japan this year and laid a wreath at the memorial for those victims of those 2 bombs. He didn't apologize, and we didn't receive any apologies from Japan for Pearl Harbor or the Death March to Bataan or any other atrocities that were committed. But a wreath was placed, and for the years, 71 years since then, residents of Nagasaki especially have remembered August 9th as the day in which all that death happened, and have committed themselves to toward working for reconciliation and peace and disarmament. Even my father-in-law had a surprise encounter. At his granddaughter's wedding, he fell into a conversation with the groom's stepfather. And they were talking with each other, small talk, and it came into the conversation that the stepfather was born and raised in Dusseldorf, Germany. And as the conversation went on, he said that he lived there until he was around 10 when a bombing raid forced him and his family to leave. And he had pictures of the planes flying overhead. You guessed it, my father-in-law was in one of those planes. And so it's amazing, they shook hands, they smiled, and undoubtedly wondered how the beginnings of reconciliation can happen through a handshake at a wedding 40 years later. We remember in order to hope, in order to transform problems into solutions. William Bradford, second governor of Plymouth Plantation, wrote a history of the formation of the colony. In remembering their departure from their pastor and their congregation in the city of Leiden in Holland, in July of 1620, around this time, they were embarking and trying to get away from Europe and get away from England in order to come to this land to form Plymouth. Brewster paraphrased the last verse of our selection from Hebrews today in talking about what that meant for them to leave their homeland. So they left that goodly and pleasant city that had been their resting place near 12 years. But they knew that they were pilgrims and looked not much on those things, but lift up their eyes to the heavens, their dearest country, and quieted their spirits. And so remember who we are, and remember whom we have been and whom we are called to be and want to be. Indeed, those who began this church, with the memory of the Plymouth Pilgrims right out front on our signboard, felt deeply called and committed to work for the abolition of slavery. And since then, we have worked for justice issues over the last century and a half or more, working for undocumented workers and working as a sanctuary for the undocumented workers and working to promote a living wage across the state and the nation and to be open and affirming of the civil rights of all those who feel marginalized, whether due to sexual orientation or gender or age or physical or mental abilities or the many other things that separate us one from the other. This is who we are called to be, and it's a wonderful thing. And I beg your forgiveness and patience and help as I may lose track of that vision of the age of Aquarius that fostered me as I falter now and then. And I pray that together we will continue to strengthen our commitment, our resolve to build a better country, a heavenly one, so that God will be pleased to call us blessed children and faithful servants. Amen.